My friends, good day. Today we're going to break down a general aviation accident, and this debrief will allow us to see how a tragedy builds up layer by layer. There is nothing in what I'm about to tell you that stands alone. You could say that's what caused the accident, but you'll see that the build-up creates a situation that seems almost irresistible. So it's August 21, 2023 in the United Kingdom. We're in England, literally in the northeast corner. We have a 72-year-old pilot with 400 flight hours who is going to make a relatively short flight, 25 minutes between two airfields, Old Buckingham. He's heading south to go to Earl's Colne Airport. We're roughly east of London's Stansted Airport, so just to let you know, you won't easily find these two airports on a map. Most of the time, these airfields were built, like Earl's Colne, they were built by the United States Air Force or by the British Air Force during World War II. They needed a lot of land, so they built everywhere, and later they became civilian. What's the reason for this flight? And now we're already going to see something interesting. The reason for this flight is that this gentleman had until August 27th to renew his private pilot's license. To renew, you have to go to, in France, it would be the GAC. In the United States, it would be the FAA or approved centers. In the United Kingdom, it's the Civil Aviation Authority. And then show them a certain number of flights, all of those that we've completed. Now, you need to know one thing, even if there's a requirement to have completed a certain number of flights and hours, all of that depends on the jurisdictions according to the licenses you have. You shouldn't kill yourself over it. It's not worth putting pressure on yourself. For example, in the United Kingdom, the Civil Aviation Authority, if you reach the deadline and haven't been able to complete the flights, you can fairly easily get an extension. You can get some extra time. It's not certain that our pilot was granted such flexibility, so he probably felt pressure to absolutely make this flight. So he took off on the morning of August 21st aboard a Piper Aircraft 28, a single-engine propeller plane, of which he was a partial owner. So he had bought a share in that plane. There's a picture where you can see him taking off. It was taken by a surveillance camera, and you can see the plane taking off like that. And behind him, there's the blue sky. So the second mistake here is that when you fly from point A to point B, even if it's only a 25-minute flight, you can't assume that the weather will be the same. At arrival, yes, the distance between the two airports isn't very big. We're talking about something like 60 kilometers. Yes, but that's not a reason. That's not an excuse. You still have to check the weather at the destination. The destination airport requires a prior permission required to go there. That means prior permission. This is usually found in small facilities where you often need to call, fill out an online form, or sometimes text. So he had called the day before to ask for permission, which was granted, but he didn't call again in the morning before leaving, and that's an important detail. It's not a mistake he made because he had permission, but it's an important detail. C will play a role later on. So he takes off, climbs to about 2,000 feet, stays in uncontrolled airspace, and heads south. Now, what's happening in the area, in the region? You should know that very often in England, towards the end of summer, we start to get what we call single digits. Temperatures, what does that mean? It means that you have a temperature that's written with a single digit. Understand that from the end of August, early in the morning, we start to get 8 or 9 degrees, so it's cold. During the day, it can get warm, up to 22, 23, even 25 degrees. But at night, it drops. So there's quite an impressive temperature difference between day and night. We have humid air coming in from the sea, from the ocean, and this air, which is full of moisture, often arrives at night on ground that is cooled by radiation because there's no cloud cover. What does that do? That often results in patches of fog in the morning, and there was some that day then. The patches of fog had been forecast for Stansted Airport during the night by the meteorological services and in a weather forecast report. It's not certain that the pilot saw them, and it did indicate actually around 4 a.m. It indicated the possibility of patches of fog. After sunrise, at the moment when the sun rises, that's the first point. The other point I wanted to tell you is that there was a satellite map that was released, and the satellite map when it was released. There are two maps. In fact, it's the same angle. The satellite takes the same place at the same time with two different camera settings. So the first setting is what we call in the visible spectrum. That means it's as if you were attached to the satellite and you were looking at the Earth, and that's what you would see. So you'll see the country's border and you'll see a white layer covering the land. So that's simple to understand. We could have taken the same image with any regular camera or iPhone as long as it was at the satellite's level. Now, the second image is an infrared image, exactly at the same place. When you look at the infrared image of the same spot, you'll see that there's nothing, there's no visible moisture. This diagram here, clouds on the visible spectrum, in infrared, nothing. It's a very strong signal for fog, either fog or stratus clouds, flat clouds like that, located at a very low altitude, potentially reaching the ground. When you know the country towards the end, like that in summer, you can guess that it's probably fog. So why does it show up like that on the map? Quite simply, these clouds, well, because fog is basically a cloud that touches the ground, well, it doesn't. Since it's very low, it doesn't have a temperature that's very different from the ground. So on infrared, you can't see it at all. You see the ground as if there's nothing there. So that's a strong indicator of fog. But again, we have no evidence that this gentleman looked at the weather report. He arrives, so he takes off and heads south. At one point, he announces himself on the Earl's Coles frequency. And then pay attention. Here's a pretty terrible detail. There's not a controller there. They have a runway office with a radio operator. A radio operator, he's there to help, but he doesn't have the authority, the dignity, if you will, of an air traffic controller. He doesn't have the training for that either. And this man, actually, there were two of them on the frequency. Well, these two guys had a very strange idea of their role or what they could or couldn't say. In fact, they're at the control desk. They see the fog. They know there's fog. By the way, just to give you an idea, around 6:30 in the morning, there's an ambulance helicopter stationed on the site. And at 6:30 in the morning, the ambulance helicopter pilot called their control center to tell them that he's going offline, which means to let them know that be careful. There's so much fog here that if you need me for an emergency, I won't be able to take off. I'm not part of the operation until I let you know that the weather has improved, just to tell you that there really was fog that was paralyzing operations at this site. When this man, this radio operator, talks to the pilot, he doesn't tell him that, and that was important. C was central in the investigation because we thought, but the guy is there. He clearly sees that there's a danger for navigation. He knows that the helicopter decided not to leave and all that, but he doesn't tell the pilot. And why actually did the guy do that? Later, he will tell the controller that, I don't have a meteorological observer's diploma. I mean, a 5-year-old child. You can see when there's fog, you can see when it's snowing, when it's raining, and he makes a very valid observation. There we have a mustached guy who's there on the frequency. He's an adult, he's of age, and he thinks that to say there's fog, he needs to have a paper. Let's just say he has the right to say it. Completely crazy. But the problem is that in aviation, whether it's general aviation or something else, you never know what kind of person you're dealing with. The guy notices the danger but stays silent. Here's what he said. He said, if he had called me in the morning before coming, I would have told him there was fog. They asked him, but then why would you have told him there was fog over the phone? Well, he said, because there are rules. You see how people think sometimes? Well, there are different rules between talking on the radio and talking on the phone. If I speak on the phone, I am free to say whatever I want, including that there is fog. If I speak on the radio, I'm not a qualified weather observer. I'm not allowed to announce it. On the other hand, if a pilot on the frequency had told me that he noticed there was fog, then I would have been allowed to pass that information along. So, a sight that left the investigators stunned. In any case, our pilot continues toward that airport. And there, what we see on the Stansted radar, we start to see it descending in altitude. That means what's happening to him is that he's getting closer. He's thinking, well, it must be clear. But then clouds descend lower and lower, surprising him, so he heads toward the ground. At one point, he's at 500 feet above the ground, so he's roughly 150, 160 meters from the ground. He's very low. He says to himself, okay, I'll skim under the clouds. Except the problem is when you have clouds that close in, forming a kind of sloped plane that goes all the way to the ground, trying to fly underneath is a dead end because sooner or later the cloud will touch the ground. What do you do at that point? That's what's going to happen to him. At some point he's very low and then suddenly he enters the fog, and at that moment his visibility drops to zero. So the problem is, once again, when a pilot isn't trained for instrument flying, entering clouds or fog and having zero visibility, it's not easy to fly using only the instruments. And what happens very often is what's called disorientation. That means the pilots start making more and more erratic, uncoordinated movements that don't match the reality of the aircraft. For example, the plane is tilted to the right, and then to correct it, they go even more to the right, and so on. Pulling on the control stick, all that, doing things randomly in the hope of getting out of it, and unfortunately, without training, it's often something that kills everyone. And actually, even if you look at airliners, even though the pilots are extremely well trained, they cheat. You won't often see an airliner flying in fog or clouds with the human pilot actually flying by hand. Usually they're on autopilot. And if the air traffic controller tells them, for example, to turn right to heading 320, what do? They go to their panel. Depending on the aircraft, they pull a button, click, 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 turn it, set heading 320 and watch the plane. They do it nicely, but they won't do it themselves, at least not our pilot. Once he finds himself in the clouds, he decides to turn back. So he says to himself, or in the fog, he says, I'll turn back. So he was coming like this. Roughly speaking, and he decides to turn back. One of the problems with turning back is, what heading do you take when you turn back? For example, 230 plus 180, how much is that? Don't pause the video or think, what's 230 plus 180? See what I mean? If suddenly you have that, basically he's heading 230, he's going to have to turn back under stress, start doing mental math. Actually, when we add 180, we can also subtract them. So that makes 50 degrees. We don't have to add them. We can subtract them when we have to add them to a high number. But all of that is just mental math and everything. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't make sense, because when we need it and we get a rush, adrenaline, stress, I can tell you that even 2 times 3, the human brain can freeze up trying to say it, okay, to find the answer. So 230 plus or minus 180, that can become something very complicated. In general, what is advised to do is you have your display showing you the heading. You see your instrument like this, you have a bug on it. So what you do is you take the bug, you turn it to a heading opposite to where you're going. You don't look at the heading, you don't read it, you just take the bug, so you turn it 180 degrees. So you put it on the path in the opposite direction, and then you go for the bug, then you make your turn to go for the bug. But don't do mental calculations with the numbers, because it's too much. So our pilot, he does this, so he tries to make his turn, so he does that, he starts to make his turn, and actually he does this. So instead of making a 180 degree turn and coming out in the opposite direction, he makes a 270 degree turn. Do you see why? 270 because you just need to add 90 degrees and you're back in the same direction. So it's like doing a 360. So that's why he does 270 degrees. That way he doesn't come out of the clouds or the fog, but he stays inside it. Afterwards, he realizes he made a mistake, so he turns like this and starts going like that. So what the people in the village see, the people who are there, is a plane flying by at low altitude Well, they hear it more than they see it. There are trees, they hear an aircraft, they know there's a propeller plane that seems lost in the fog. The guy here, he was at 500 feet here. He's going to climb to 1,100. Probably. It's quite typical in these situations not to control the altitude and sometimes want to go up thinking you'll get out above the layer. In any case, once he gets into this area already there, he's totally disoriented. He's someone who can no longer read his artificial horizon, someone whose inner ear, what he sees on the horizon, what his inner ear tells him, it's something that's totally out of sync. And this will be reflected in his erratic way of controlling the plane. And at some point, here we have trees. Here we have trees like this. There are trees, 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 some kind of fir trees. And then he crashes into the fir trees. Someone sees him appear. And the person described that the plane was on its side, so he could read the registration numbers on the wing. The plane was completely on its side. The nose was roughly 45 degrees below the horizon. And unfortunately, that image is what pilots see during the last moments of their lives when it's too late to get out of it. Because if you come out with an image like that and you're, let's say, at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, indeed, you still have enough altitude below you to correct, recover, and then say to yourself, that was a close call. But when you're in situations like that, it's only once you come out and see, and this time, yes, you understand. What is the position of the plane? It's too late. We're 3 seconds before impact. So the plane will hit here, then it will hit the trees, and after that, it will end up here. In a kind of green field, a grassy area in front of a historic house, it crashes violently into the ground. It catches fire because it was fully fueled. To tell you, it had 4.5 hours of fuel. It could have almost made it to France from where it was. In fact, it crashed, it caught fire, and the pilot died instantly. The investigators didn't find any problem with the plane. The plane was in perfect condition. There was nothing wrong with it. It was well maintained. The continuity of the flight controls had been confirmed, so the cables and everything were there. The propeller was twisted in such a way that it was easy to imagine the engine was producing torque. It was driven by the torque, so when it hit the ground, it twisted in a very particular way. There was nothing else except for this poor man who found himself in the fog. He didn't check the weather, and the guy who was supposed to tell him didn't tell him. So the end result is one dead person and a lot of material damage, a destroyed plane, fire, things getting worse and all that. That's it, my friends. So what lesson can we learn from this? I'm just going to be very, very, very careful not to rely on anyone. Actually, that's it. Stress is like driving a car. You're not just responsible for yourself, but also for others' mistakes. All right, always, always well protected. That's it. As much not there anymore. Maybe I had too much, but who subscribes? Mouse blockage is, it's time well. You will still have in see a little very soon.